say you are what you eat. If that's true, then a whole lot of people in this country and across the Western world are built out of strange ingredients, all manner of stuff consumed by billions of people every day, but that few, if paying attention, would recognise as food, by which I mean natural whole food, because it's not food, not in the natural sense at least. If you are what you eat, then most are made of ingredients they couldn't name, things that didn't grow in fields, that never had a heartbeat, that never walked, swam or flew. Just as we build our bodies from the food we eat, so we build our understanding of the world from other things we take in. Information, in the form of things we read, things we see, things we're told by those we trust. If too many have had their stomachs filled with God knows what, building their bodies with rubbish for the most part, waste materials from industrial processes, chemical cocktails cooked to taste like something they're not, things never intended to be eaten by man or beast, then at least as many more have had their heads filled to bursting too, with more fakery, toxic fakery, concocted nonsense made palatable with more artificial flavouring. I'm minded to say doctored, meaning to falsify, to disguise, to adulterate. An interesting word all on its own, but I digress. Instead of eating real whole food, too many eat fake food now. Things that didn't exist in any form at all until the last 100 years or so. Things made of ingredients doctored until human beings can be persuaded to swallow them and keep them down. And at the same time, rather than building an understanding of the world as it really is, too many are leaving the truth out of their lives entirely and swallowing lies instead. Lies doctored until they pass for something wholesome. Part of the truth that's missing from too many diets is that the swallowing of fake food and lies is nothing new, that people have been drinking the Kool-Aid for real and metaphorically for a long time. The first entirely synthetic, wholly fake food was coal butter, which is exactly what it sounds like, exactly as it ought to have said on the tin, but didn't, of course. An edible sludge made from coal and dyed yellow so it could be passed off as something a human being might eat. Coal butter was whipped up by a German food chemist, Arthur Imhausen. During the Second World War, Nazi Germany needed to produce as much food and fuel as possible from within its own borders. From its huge reserves of low-quality coal called lignite, a way was found to make liquid fuel and also explosives, vital in wartime obviously, as well as soap. Imhausen took the same raw material used to make the soap, being what we know as paraffin wax, and found a way to make it into a fat that could be dyed and flavoured until it might be passed off as a kind of butter, edible by human beings. The companies that grew fat from the innovations like all that fuel, soap and butter included IG Farben, once the largest chemical and pharmaceutical company in the world. During the 1940s, IG Farben tested that butter on thousands of souls from concentration camps like Auschwitz. Data found after the war, the result of testing that was not made public at the time, revealed prolonged consumption of coal butter led to kidney disease. Dogs wouldn't touch the stuff. But since it was mostly to be given to U-boat crews, men with life expectancies in wartime of just a couple of months, no one was much bothered about the long-term effects of them eating fake butter. A subsidiary of IG Farben supplied the Zyklon B poison gas used to murder more than 1 million Jewish people in Auschwitz. The artificial sweetener we know as saccharin is another product made 100 years ago from more coal. You are what you eat, remember? This is what big government and big business thinks of the likes of you and me. At least Marie Antoinette is supposed to have wanted the poor folk to eat not coal but cake. Let them hear lies is also nearer the mark. Tell them anything our governments clearly think and they'll swallow it right down. For as long as I can remember, we've been being frightened away from the good stuff, which is to say the truth and also healthy food. I'm of the vintage that grew up being sold the low-fat lifestyle, low-fat spreads instead of butter. Remember the Nazis and all that coal made yellow and spreadable, spongy white bread that lasts for days without going stale, the insistence that eggs are bad news, best avoided. Go low-fat and high-carb, and always more and more ultra-processed gunk for reheating in the microwave. On and on and on, leaving out the good stuff and replacing it with pap and gruel. Cereals were food for livestock until farmers in the US had a glut of the stuff year on year in the early 20th century. in the years before the dust bowl of the grapes of wrath ravaged the farmland anyway. But what to do with all that surplus cereal? Way more than the livestock herds required. And then along came the breakfast cereal industry and the notion that while meat and fat stimulated unwholesome and unwanted lusts and desires, cereals would dampen all that down and create a more passive, peaceable, lustless population, and the rest of the cattle cake repurposed for the poor. As well as a diet of cereal and low-fat fake butter and the rest, it has been a diet of lies about health and so much more. Vegetable is a word that makes us think healthy thoughts, and so vegetable oils sound like a healthy alternative to animal fats like real butter, tallow and lard. But vegetable oils, canola oil, sunflower oil, palm oil and the rest, started life as cheap lubricants for farm machinery. Rancid in their raw state, foul-smelling and as far from appetising as it's possible to get, it was only the advent of processes by which those industrial byproducts might be clarified, made palatable, that they could be bottled and then set on supermarket shelves as fit for human consumption. For years we've been bombarded with claims that veganism will save the world. There's nothing green about that agenda. Notions like flying an avocado halfway around the world rather than eating something grown in a field up the road, somehow promising a brighter future. And have you had a look at the lists of ingredients on so-called plant-based foods? Well, the ingredients for a decent beef burger are, well, beef and maybe some salt and pepper. The ingredients for a plant-based burger offering read more like an A to Z for an explosive chemistry experiment. Most recently, we've had the spectre of insects for protein, and so a future of great barns filled with critters bred by the billions for rendering into yet more burgers utterly devoid of beef. Swarms of locusts, hothoused, what could possibly go wrong? And then the promise of lab-grown meat, a Frankenstein creation in my opinion, animal cells resultant from a biopsy harvested from living tissue and then coddled in a nutrient bath until fibres form that mimic the texture of flesh. I say this comes from a place of contempt, from a contemptuous view of our species, held by a powerful, wealthy few, that fake and false is good enough for the likes of us. Everything else has been made so expensive, all but out of reach, rent, energy, the other stuff of life, that now in the West of all places, the so-called developed West of Britain and the US, the mass of the populations can afford to spend no more than 10% of their incomes, half that amount if possible, on the food they might put inside their bodies, inside the bodies of their children. Everything else is almost too expensive to buy, but life itself is as cheap as chips deep fried in oil, little better than toxic waste. And all the while we're fed this crap, we receive a serving of lies on the side. All the nonsense about the so-called pandemic, about the safety and efficacy of the jabs, about the war in Ukraine, about the climate, about the Middle East, all that fakery and falsehood. Farmers across the world are fighting a land grab, a state-sponsored effort to force them off their fields so those fields might be repurposed for who knows what, but certainly not for growing wholesome food. Bill Gates, no scientist he, no doctor, but influencing the healthcare of billions on account only of his wealth, is now the largest private landowner in the US, more than 250,000 acres and counting, and he's no farmer either. In the UK, it will shortly be illegal to harbour so much as a single fugitive chicken in your back garden for meat and eggs or just as pets, unless each is registered with the state. I say the relentless push behind this move and the rest of the war on agriculture is to widen the already yawning chasm between people and their understanding of healthy food. Never mind the ability to actually access it. And that's before the sinister threat of mRNA jabs for livestock and other foods, and more Frankenstein sprays to extend the shelf life of everything else. You are what you eat, and you're also what you understand. I've come to understand that nothing in recent times is about public health, if by that you mean an intention to keep people healthy. The last thing people needed during the times of a respiratory illness was to be shut indoors, barred from keeping fit, gyms closed while the fast food outlets remained open. Never a word about healthy food, far less the benefits of supplements as cheap and readily available as vitamin D, proven to help keep people well in the face of all ills. I say the preferred option of the state is a population made fat and sick by poor food and unhealthy lifestyles, and then propped up by fabulously expensive drugs of unproven and uncertain safety from Big Pharma. The lies are everywhere. Liars lie about everything after all. The snake oil salesmen are everywhere. This week I watched so-called Foreign Secretary David Cameron and US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken address a press conference. Furrowed brows, hands clasped. I watched their lips moving. Cameron actually described Ukraine as value for money, an investment that had not cost the life of a single US serviceman, somehow forgetting the 500,000 dead Ukrainian men and boys. Neither would commit to ending arms sales to Israel. Cameron talked about more money for NATO as a 75th birthday present. Kerching, kerching. Here's the thing, if it's not the vegetable oils and the lab meat and the rest of the fake food and the clamp down on healthy living that's made you and yours sick these years past, then the lies from those in positions of authority must surely make your gorge rise. Pass the sick bag. I'm joined this week by journalist, presenter and friend Jasmine Birtles. Hi, Jasmine.
Hello there.
Thanks for being here. I don't know about you, but I look out now at the people around me and they don't look well.
No.
In a way that I was never previously aware of. Do you sense the same?
Yeah, well, I know what you mean, but, you know, like you, I was brought up with the low-fat diet, etc. I mean, when I was a child, we had a lot of food from the garden. My mum cooked from raw and all that. But we also had cakes made with margarine. We had quite a lot of margarine around. Ate butter, but a lot of margarine. Angel Delight, goodness knows what. I mean, that's pure chemicals, you know, let's be honest. Fish paste, meat paste, you know, there was all sorts of rubbish. And I do remember meeting some Americans and thinking they looked a lot healthier than we did. But I agree that right now we have a level of, for example, obesity that was not seen for a moment when I was growing up. I mean, really only in the last, I guess, 30 years.
And there's a kind of it's a pallor.
Yes.
About people.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. You know, people grossly overweight are now everywhere where they used to be, you know, eye-catchingly rare within my lifetime.
Yeah, me too.
But there's a kind of a greyness,
yes,
a moistness, I don't know, that people just, in increasing numbers, look careworn and anxious and just not well.
And I think you're right to mix the actual food and the lies that we are, as you say, swallowing, because much of it is mental. I mean, we're going to talk about all sorts of different diets, I know, and I've been very interested to hear people who are absolutely determined and absolutely 100% convinced that their diet is the one, and many of them are diametrically opposed, you know, veganism and, you know, meat only, all of that, and you do find quite often that those who are completely convinced do look a bit more healthy than those who aren't convinced.
Don't you think whether people do decide, and however they go about deciding whether they'll be vegan or they'll only eat meat or some variation in between, that it's the very act of engagement that probably is making a big part of contributing to their being better in every way, because they're switched on, paying attention and thinking and acting positively rather than just being on the receiving end of whatever they're given.
Yes, and as you say, being on the receiving end, this sort of passivity, this sense of helplessness that we've had, I think, for years. I mean, you mentioned the coal butter, which I'd never heard of, but also in the Victorian times, apparently Victorian bakers would put sawdust in the bread to, you know, as you do. I mean, why wouldn't you?
At least sawdust is a natural product.
Yes, well, yes, there is that. I think that's probably what they said. It's a natural product, whatever. And that contributed to child mortality, apparently, in certain areas. Yeah. So, you know, it's happened all the time, but it's happening, I think, on an industrial scale now. We're finding everything's got chemicals in. There was a piece in the Mail just recently saying that strawberries are the worst for having all sorts of long-term chemicals in them. And I love strawberries. And, you know, it's not even manufactured. This is strawberries.
What I want to get to across the next, hour or couple of hours is whether or not there's any kind of intent. I have begun to wonder if a sick, overweight, weakened population, and also miseducated and all of the rest of it, isn't simply easier to deal with, and that you've got constant profit. I mean, a patient cured is a customer lost.
Yes, it is. And if I put my money hat on, as you know, I'm a financial journalist, something I talk about a lot now is pensions and the very shaky future of them, because, as you know, we and all the Western countries have massively overprinted money. We are hugely indebted, and a large amount of that is to pay the state pensions. And, you know, there are a few ways that you can combat the state pension problem. You can either do what we are doing now and just make it that you have to be older and older and older to get the state pension, or you have a lot of immigration, because it's the working immigrants who are paying, who would help to pay for the state pension, or you just kill them off, just kill off the old people.
I know where my money is, if that's a bet.
Yeah.
It's a break already, after which I'll be joined by a biochemical engineer to talk about whether there are drawbacks to eating lab-grown meat. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go away. Welcome back to me, Neil Oliver, and The Neil Oliver Show. OK, first question. Would you eat meat grown in a laboratory? It's a question that seems to divide opinion. Joining me now, though, is Ivor Cummins, a biochemist who feels that we should be wary of such products. Ivor, thanks for joining me. I'm a great admirer of your work. Good to see you there.
Oh, likewise, Neil. I'm a huge admirer of your work also, goes without saying.
Good stuff. Now, to get to the meat of the issue, pardon the pun, can you describe for me the reality of lab-grown meat? What are we actually dealing with here?
Well, we should probably draw a contrast with the fake meat problem. So the Beyond Burgers and all these things, they're fake meat, and they're made up with refined grains, GMOs, soy, and they're basically the ultimate ultra-processed junk food, which has caused most of the chronic disease in the world over the last half century. So they're completely disgusting muck. The laboratory-grown meat, it's hard to find out exactly what the harms might be. It's basically mimicking real meat, and it doesn't have all of the refined grains and junk in it. But I think the problem with the laboratory-grown meat is that animals reared by humans properly with regenerative farming are the best possible way of getting all the polypeptides, all of the nutrients, all of the goodness of meat. And it's important to note as well that the vast majority of paleoanthropologists, without question, would acknowledge that Homo sapiens grew their extraordinary brains primarily through scavenging of organ meats and carcasses, and then going on to being the most successful hunters on the planet. So the reason that human species is here is the incredible nutrient density of meat. So if you go to make it in a lab, you may not make a harmful product per se, but there's no way you'll match the incredible value of real meat. And the other problem is that it's mainly being driven based on an environmental climate premise. But if you go to sacredcow.info and look at all their infographics, the problem with actual properly reared animals for meat is grossly exaggerated. And that's even if you acknowledge the whole climate change disaster scenarios. Even if you acknowledge them, the contribution from properly reared meat is minuscule. It has no meaning. So the whole basis for doing lab-grown meat in this kind of technocracy nonsense has no actual basis in the first place. That's a huge problem. It's driven on a lie, and it's for profiteering and other ulterior motives, I would say.
When you mention ulterior motive, I said earlier in the show, it strikes me as indicative of a kind of broader contempt in which we, the people, are being held by those who are in a position to exert authority over us. There's a feeling that, well, that's good enough for them. Why are we giving them the good stuff? You know, when we can give them ersatz, imitation, facsimile food. It almost feels like another means by which we, the people, are being put in our place.
Yeah, for sure, Neil. And the beauty is that all of this problem is documented. So from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund through to the World Economic Forum, Club of Rome, and all of these organizations over 70 years. It's all documented, and it culminates in Agenda 2030 of the UN. That's also documented. And yes, indeed, they want a much more managed ant farm, is the way I describe it, in the West. China's got a great ant farm. Everyone's under control, surveillance, tracking, and highly dependent on the government. And in the West, I think there's a jealousy looking at that. And dependency, I think, is a big part of this. If you have local healthy meats and vegetables grown in individual countries, it's the best for the climate, it's the best for local self-sufficiency, and sovereignty. But all of this push is to create a fake food pipeline. And ideally, as we're seeing in Europe, the farmers' protests, they want to take away local kind of self-sufficiency.
And
they want to create dependency. So I think that's one of the big advantages of all of the ultra-processed food and fake food, and indeed lab food. You create a pipeline where the people are dependent on that over time, and they lose their local natural resources and self-sufficiency.
Hold that thought,
I think
Ivor.
that's one of the angles here, as well as giving less nutrient density and less ideal foods that give humans health and mental acuity and vigor. I mean, we know about Genghis Khan and all the horses. They lived, fought on their horses, and they ate their horses when they were short of food.
Ivor, I'm just going to bring in my guest in the studio here, just to hear her reaction to what you're saying here. Jasmine, a culture of dependency. Do you think that there is an intention here to take people away, even less agency, less control over your life, and more dependency?
You mentioned, for example, just having to register your chickens. I mean, an absolutely ridiculous concept. I assume it's because that once a year or so they'll decide there's something like bird flu and they all have to be culled. I mean, if you don't register it and they find you've got one, it's a £5,000 fine. When you have stupid stuff like that, and farmers actually being watched via satellite and being fined for ploughing their field at a time they're not supposed to be ploughing their field, this is clearly a surveillance state that they're trying to bring in, as Ivor says, just like China, they want to be like China. And it's all about control, I think.
Ivor, it seems, I mentioned to Jasmine earlier in the show, but it seems paradoxical to me that here in the West, where we have wealth, we have all this technology at our fingertips, and yet the people seem to be and are measurably in declining health. Mental, physical and spiritual. How can that be when we live in the land of notional plenty and yet everyone looks grey and fat?
Yeah, well, Neil, and you know more than most with your historical expertise, but I'm a World War II buff as well. And the reality is we're 3 generations since World War II and people have gotten really soft. They've had it so good for so long. We have an incredible safety culture and everyone's terrified of everything. So that's weakened them. But the other huge thing since World War II is ultra-processed food. So I call it the devil's triad. It's sugar, refined grains, and processed vegetable or seed oils. And that's what makes up most of ultra-processed food. And that's 60% of UK calories, approximately, from the BMJ. So our people are poisoned now, and they do become fat depressed and much less able to be resilient and to pay attention to their surroundings. I've often said, in the morning, if there was magically only meat, fish and eggs and maybe some vegetables available, that was the only food. Within a month or two, the population would be visibly transformed and half of the pharma companies would go out of business because hypertension and all its related problems and cholesterol issues, they're all driven by the ultra-processed food, which makes up most of the calories. So there is another kind of interest in feeding people crap food. You make them fat, docile, and much easier to manage in your chosen ant farm.
It is a good business point, actually, because, if you have food connected to farmer? And we do. They're very, very much, the food producers are very much connected to the farm producers. It's a lovely virtuous circle where you poison people with the food and then they have to go to the farmer and then you continue to poison them, etc., etc.
I think there is definitely a line of thought here that I'm interested in pursuing. I've run out of time with you, but thank you so much for your enlightening contribution, and I will continue to consume your product online. A fascinating orator you are in so many areas. Thank you, Ivor Cummins. Yet again, another break, but don't go anywhere. We'll be back in a couple. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. My next guest this evening is comedian Lewis Schaefer, who by any standards has a fairly radical approach to diet. Lewis joins me now. Lewis, it's great to see you. Tell me first of all why you embarked on a change to your diet.
Yeah.
Specifically, you had health issues, did you not?
No. I didn't realize I had health issues until I lost a lot of weight. And then I said, and then I started to, as I'm losing the weight, I was feeling so much better. But then I started to maintain the weight and it all crumbled again.
What were the let's say the complaints, the health complaints that you had that you subsequently have found yourself to be without?
Well, let's start from the top of my head. I had full body psoriasis. I had a sleep apnea, which is one of those CPAP machines that cost like thousands on the NHS, just like, I mean, free, but whatever. It's, you know, with the I had to go to sleep and very sexy. I had frozen shoulder, trigger finger. I had gout. I had plantar fasciitis. I had edema, which is swollen hands and swollen feet. I had erectile dysfunction.
You're a fine figure of a man, weren't you?
I was horrible.
But so what did you embark upon? Now I'll say up front, I've been following you on social media because of the photographs that you post of your daily platefuls.
Yeah. I do that to be
fascinate me.
Yeah.
So what diet have you embarked upon? And by diet, I really mean a way of life.
Yeah, that's true, because people think a diet is just about losing weight. It's not about losing weight anymore, because I lost weight the old-fashioned way, which is basically torturing yourself.
So what do you eat?
I eat steak and eggs, basically. I've now for 18 months, I've been raw steak, raw beef, and I try for raw eggs. I try to eat 3 to 5 raw eggs a day, just the yolks.
Yeah. Now, why?
That's what I eat. That's basically what I eat.
So that would be a fairly unglamorous cut of beef.
That's the cooked food that that the woman who I live with. This is me eating the runny eggs. This is not an indication, but that's what I eat. I eat raw eggs. That's scrambled eggs with butter. That's where my girlfriend cooked me some food, and I had to eat it because she says she's my girlfriend.
And why raw? Why have you? Not only are you limiting yourself to just a handful of things, you don't cook them either.
No. But because this is what I've been doing this for 5 years, and after a while, I know enough stuff. But I know. But
explain it to me. Why have you got? Why
raw?
Because the human species has been cooking meat for
hundreds of thousands of years.
At least. So why would you say that there's a benefit to raw?
There's a benefit to raw because it's more hydrating, because it doesn't kill any of the nutrients. This is everything that I've learned off of the internet. And it doesn't kill the nutrients that are in there, cooked food. It's not as chewy. It's just delicious. It's raw is better after a while.
How do you, listening to Lewis describe this, I mean, it absolutely fascinates me that the man was a catalogue of medical ailments, switches to raw beef, raw eggs, and a few other things besides butter and whatnot, and he's now as fit as a flea.
Yeah, field of muscle.
Very
We're not advocating it as a lifestyle choice. We're not, do not take dietary advice from this show. No. But what do you make of?
Well, it is so interesting. I mean, it makes me think of Jordan Peterson, of course, who's doing something similar, and his daughter as well, Laura. Laura.
Michaela.
I'm trying to think of somebody else who does pretty much exactly the same. So, but it's meat and potatoes or meat and broccoli. There are, people have different ones, and it's steak, not just meat. In fact, it's steak. So I do know people. I also have friends who are raw vegans. I've got 2 friends that I can think of who became raw vegan again because of all sorts of physical problems that they had, and they swear blind that raw veganism has made them healthier.
Has made them blind.
Yeah,
that's why they swear it blind. Is that you got to give Jordan Peterson a shout out. I've been doing this 6 years. I've been doing this diet of only meat, mostly. I cheat. Everybody cheats, but I have 95% of my diet is not plants. It's meat. But I was heading in that direction. You had Ivor Cummings on the show, and he was a big influence on my life. And then you saw. I'm not the only one. That's why in about a year this will not be weird at all.
No,
in the interest of what we like to call balance, I can tell you that I've got here the NHS diet guidelines, okay, the National Health Service, which fascinate me as well. I'm fascinated by so much. 5 portions of fruit and veg a day seems reasonable. Base your meals on starchy foods like potatoes, bread, rice, or pasta. That's anathema to you. Have some dairy alternatives, such as soy. Now, that does not sound... Well, it's interesting. Eat some beans, pulses, fish, eggs, meat and other protein. Choose unsaturated oils. Now, that's the very vegetable oils that I think are the devil's own sweat.
Yeah.
And eat them in small amounts. Drink plenty of fluid, 6 to 8 glasses a day. That sounds fair enough.
I don't think you should. The water is one of the worst things. You don't need water when you're on a raw diet.
You get enough in
You get enough in the meat. Animals aren't drinking water all the time.
You should. Well, I don't. Are there any downsides? I mean, apart from it must be boring.
It is really boring. And here's the downside. The downside is people think you're going to die, and people are wishing me dead. And I made a mistake. I put the thing up. I put the pictures up, and people want me. They want me dead because they don't want it to be right, because they can't believe, because it involves. They think I'm killing more animals than their vegan diet, which is not true. So they want me dead. So if I die tomorrow, everybody's going to say, "You see, I told you." If I get hit by a bus, they'd blame my meat diet.
Yeah.
You're right that if people are sceptical, people are entitled to be sceptical about what you're saying, although the physical manifestation seems to speak for itself, given what you were describing before. But as you say, Jordan Peterson and Michaela Peterson, his daughter, for years now I've been reading about how they have it. If they don't still, they certainly did for a long time, subsist purely on beef and water, a bit of salt.
Yeah.
And Michaela in particular had juvenile arthritis. She was serious suffering in all manner of ways, and since switching on to this extremely radical meat-only diet, she is extremely fit, as the photographs that she posts of herself will plainly testify. I mean, at the very least, it's fascinating.
It is.
Yeah. The key thing is that she started this horrible diet. She's like 30 years old, so she started it when she was 30 years ago, when it was I'm old enough to remember butter. So my body isn't as bad as that. So, she's obviously, my bad health came 30 years out, to now.
Lewis Schaefer, obviously, this is just out of interest. We're not suggesting that anyone, makes decisions based on what they're saying here, but I think all it illustrates is that what we don't understand about food and the way in which our individual bodies process food is a lot. And there's a great deal more to understand.
And we are different. I mean, it's interesting about Michaela because the people on the whole that I know who are eating meat only are mostly men. And the people I know who are more vegetarian and certainly vegan, raw vegan, there's mostly women. I mean, but there does seem to be a bit of a spread there.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have to break now, but we will be continuing this food and nutrition-based conversation as we progress. We'll be chatting next to Chelsea Munro from PETA, who says that lab-grown meat is the future because it will help to save the planet. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. My next guest this evening is Chelsea Munro, the Digital Campaigns Manager at PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, who feels that the move towards in vitro meat is happening and not a minute too soon. Chelsea joins me now. Good evening, Chelsea. Thanks for joining me.
Evening. Thanks for having me.
It seems like an obvious question I have to ask. Have you tried in vitro lab-grown meat? Have you sampled it?
I haven't, no, and I don't feel the need to try it, as since giving up meat, I feel great in myself. However, I'm really very supportive of anybody who would choose lab-grown meat over an animal who's been slaughtered in an abattoir.
Are you persuaded that lab-grown meat is better for the environment than livestock herds kept in the traditional way?
Absolutely. Yeah, to put it into context, it takes 16 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat. The way that we farm now uses so much water, energy, and resources, and it's so wasteful that the United Nations has cited farming as one of the leading causes of climate changes. And it's estimated that this in vitro meat would use a very small fraction of the resources and energy that factory farms would do. So it's definitely a no-brainer. It would be so much better for the environment.
The reason I ask, I'm looking at a study by Livestock, Environment and People, a programme at the Oxford Martin School, and it's very recent research, and it suggests that while uptake of particular forms of cultured meat could indeed be better for the climate, others could actually lead to higher global temperatures in the long run. Now, I would say that it would seem that there isn't necessarily a consensus supporting the notion that lab-grown meat is definitely better for the environment in every case, and that is if a person subscribes to the notion that livestock is detrimental to the environment in any case. But I think it has to be fair to say that the jury is still out on whether it's better for the environment. So there would have to be better and other reasons for advocating a move to lab-grown meat than purely the environmental.
There are. Yeah, I mean, animal rights is definitely one of the leading causes. Currently, right now in the UK, 300,000 chickens die every single day in the meat industry. We can take cells from animals without even harming them, and there's already cell lines available for scientists to use for lab-grown meat. So we really could be saving billions and billions of lives by implementing lab-grown meat.
This drift to this technology of creating meat where there was none seems fundamentally wrong.
Yes, because I found myself drifting away from meat over the last few years, partly because I'm one who, I find it difficult because I love animals. I find it difficult that I would be eating, these little soft furry creatures, or maybe not soft furry, but creatures. But at the same time, I really, if I'm going to do that, I would go to vegetables. I'd be pescatarian, maybe just to eat fish, etc., rather than have some kind of, as you say, Frankenstein meat product. It just doesn't feel right. There's a sense of control, and also, like with the electric vehicles, there are all sorts of hidden costs, hidden ways in which those are harming the environment. And I think that the production of processed meat, pretend meat, will have all sorts of ways of harming the environment, which you don't get, I think, with animals, personally.
To me, the prime consideration is the people, are the people. It's the welfare of people.
Yes.
And there's something profoundly anti-human about a great deal of the broader agenda of 2030 or however what you want to describe it, that people are not being properly respected. You can have your conversations about whether or not animals are properly treated, but we're definitely, in my mind, drifting into territory where people are not being treated with respect?
Oh, very much so. And as you know, one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, Patrick Moore, he's recently said that if we get to net zero, half of the population of the world will die. Now, many will say that that's part of the point, that, you know, the agenda, the depopulation agenda, if it does exist, is to remove 7.5 billion people from the world. Well, if you can remove more.
Chelsea, can I put that point to you while I still have you? The broader agenda, yes. 2030, to me, and Jasmine was echoing the feeling, it feels anti-human. It feels that people are being put into second place or third place, and that it's an unhappy direction of travel.
Yeah, so actually I wanted to touch back on what you were saying a minute ago about sort of it feeling a bit unnatural, but there's actually nothing more unnatural than taking animals from their environment and cramming them into sheds by the thousands so they can't turn around. And Frankenstein genetic modifications that have been used on animals it's vastly unnatural. Chickens in the meat industry, for example, they're bred to grow extremely large, heavy upper bodies very, very quickly to maximize profits. Their bodies then can't be supported by their legs, and they collapse, and they have to sit in their waste until they're taken to the abattoir. And the waste can give them ammonia burns. And there's just simply no way to ethically or humanely kill an animal. When their throats are slit and they're plunged into the defeathering tanks which stored them, there is just no way, whether that's a local farm or a farm further away, it's not humane. And I do completely agree that the best diet is oats, grain, and fruits and vegetables, and I completely support that. But if we're looking at meat that's, from an animal who's been killed in an abattoir versus meat that's being grown in a clean and sterilised laboratory, that is definitely a better option.
Chelsea, I absolutely respect your opinion and your feelings about meat consumption. As I do, I respect the way that so many people express that feeling that what we're doing is wrong. But for my own part, I absolutely want animals that are being raised for food to be ethically and decently treated, and I believe there is a way of doing that, as I believe there is a humane way in which animals can be slaughtered. But I absolutely respect your opinion on that. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. That's all for the TV portion of the Neil Oliver Show, but stay tuned for Free Speech Nation. There's plenty more extra content on gbnews.com. Ecopreneur Simon Godek will tell us about the powers of vitamin D. We'll hear from Casey Means, co-author of The Good Energy, and I'll also be joined by Davinia Taylor, the former actress turned author and nutritionist. See you there. Good evening and welcome along to the second part of the Neil Oliver Show, a chance for longer, more in-depth chats with my guests. I'll be continuing my discussion this evening on the subject of health and nutrition and talking about what we should actually be putting in our bodies to ensure we are living our most healthy lives. I'll be addressing the problems presented by over-processed foods that we're feeding to the next generation. And finally, I'll be joined by actress turned nutritionist Davinia Taylor to talk about how she turned her addictions into an addiction to living the healthiest life possible, and how others should and could do the same. All of that in the company of my panellist, journalist and presenter, Jasmine Birtles. Next tonight we'll be chatting to Dr. Simon Godek, who lives now in the Brazilian jungle, about the benefits, amongst other things, of vitamin D. Simon left the rat race to live off-grid and feels that if we used what humanity had given us to a better extent, we wouldn't be suffering a lot of the medical problems we are facing now. Simon joins me right this moment. Hello, Simon. How are you?
Hey, Neil. I'm good. And you?
Very good. Now, I introduced you as being off grid and having left behind aspects of the rat race, but it's a bit of an oversimplification. You paid a great personal and professional price, did you not, during the COVID years, because of the way in which you spoke out?
That's true. I lost 2 jobs for speaking out against COVID, especially the measures. And I hear myself double.
Yeah. So it was forced upon you to some extent, or to a great extent, the move. So tell us, where exactly are you now, and how do you live there?
So I'm now in the middle of the Brazilian rainforest. It's called Mato Atlântico. And I found a house here, a quite old house, and I renovated it and I made it totally off-grid. So I have a solar system, I have batteries, I have my own water, I have a greenhouse, and I use Starlink. So to be connected to the internet.
And is it, this having been thrust upon you, is it a way of life now in its totality that you're happy about? Do you see the advantage and a healthy progression in your own development?
Well, it wasn't always my plan to live somewhere off grid in the middle of nowhere in Brazil.
I can imagine.
But on the other hand, Neil, it just gave me a totally new perspective of life.
Although these are not choices that you would have made had not circumstances intervened, are you learning new things about yourself, and about the potential of a life lived in a different way?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I left my culture. So my culture is the Netherlands and Germany, and I would say the Western culture in general. But here in Brazil, I mean, like in the middle of nowhere, my next neighbor is approximately 10 minutes away, which is far. I'm living really in a totally different life. So I wake up in the morning, I go outside, I look after the chicken, I get some eggs, I go into the greenhouse. I work on the land, and back in Europe was like waking up, getting some tea, cycling to the university, just sitting there the whole day writing something, and going back home. So my life changed totally. And I mean, by speaking up against the COVID madness and also the global agenda, I kind of got some following on social media. So right now I'm also trying to learn more and more into to kind of tell my followers what I learned, and to regarding permaculture, regarding globalism, regarding what I learned here in Brazil with this new society. So my life changed totally. It's totally upside down.
And you mentioned, the things that you're learning and the learning opportunities, I suppose, that have been thrust upon you. Now, I know, you and I have spoken offline in the past about vitamin D. And the role that it could and should have played during the years just past. I suppose my question is, Simon, do we in the West have some sort of epidemic of vitamin D deficiency?
Definitely. So when COVID started, or let's say when the pandemic started in March 2020, I was just waiting for the public officials to say, "Hey guys, just get your vitamin D to appropriate level, which is higher than 50 nanograms per milliliter, and you don't have to worry about anything." But they didn't. They locked us up. They didn't want us to go outside anymore into the sun. I was like, this is crazy. So I wrote this scientific article in May, June 2020 explaining why COVID wouldn't pose any threat to you if you just had a vitamin D blood serum level of higher than 50. It went through peer review. I had 3 peer reviewers, and they loved my publication, and it got online and on a high-ranked journal. And this caused problems. So the university got contacted by some movement. They're called skeptics, but they're not skeptics. They are governmental bootlickers. And I got into some internal trouble at the university for publishing this paper, even though they checked it afterwards and they looked up the content, they looked up the quality, and they said, like, Simon, what you have been written is all right, but please in the future, whenever you submit something in the name of the university, please inform us about this. So it was like something totally new, which kind of shocked me.
And COVID and its application relative to COVID notwithstanding, there does as well seem to be a general misunderstanding or an absence of information about the general benefit of simply taking vitamin D, which is cheap, readily available, and safe. Which that seems bizarre. That a way in which people's health could generally be boosted, their well-being generally improved, is just overlooked for no reason that makes any humane sense.
Exactly. I mean, if you just look at the numbers, at least 90% of US Americans are vitamin D deficient. And this number increases as the obesity rate increases as well. So knowing that only 10% have higher vitamin D levels than, I think it was 30 nanograms per milliliter, which I still consider very low. And we also know that people who have levels higher than 50 nanograms per milliliter hardly get sick. That the chance to get sick of the flu, of COVID, of a common cold is 2%. If you have vitamin D levels of 12 nanograms per milliliter, which is the average in the US, the chance is higher than 40%. You can do the math. It's 20 times higher. So I don't know why they were going after vitamin D and ivermectin, which are both extremely effective and also cheap. And also, it's very difficult to get an overdose. So they were going after these two in particular. And I was kicked off social media, off Twitter in June 2021, just for posting a link to my peer-reviewed vitamin D paper for medical misinformation. I mean, you can't make this up. Then I got Twitter to court, and here in Brazil, and I was like, "Hey guys, look at what I've wrote. It's not wrong. Just check it out." And the judge said, like, "Well, we don't care. It's up to Twitter who they leave on the platform or not." So this was my life until I got back on Twitter, at least.
We seem to have evolved a system and a lifestyle in the West that feeds people poor food, low quality food, ultra processed food, and it sees more and more people overweight, unhealthy, unfit, unhappy, increasingly dependent on medical interventions. Why don't our governments encourage us to be well, to be a population of active people with agency, taking responsibility for our own health and well-being?
Yeah, I mean, look, it even goes so far. We know that, for example, vitamin D can prevent sepsis at hospitals, and the majority of the people dying in hospitals because of sepsis. Of course, if you take vitamin D, if you start taking vitamin D now, it takes up to 2 or 3 months until you have adequate levels. So, I mean, if you're in a hospital, you don't want to take normal vitamin D, but you can take bioavailable vitamin D orally or IV. It's called calcifediol. And if you take this, it just takes 3 to 4 hours to get your vitamin D level up to whatever you want, 50, 80, 100. So actually, we could reduce the likelihood of people dying of sepsis by more than 90% at the hospitals. And people know this. I mean, this is public information. There are many publications about this, but it just doesn't get implemented into policies. So our governments, the people available, they know exactly the role of vitamin D and how to prevent people from getting sick, which means like making sure that everybody has an adequate vitamin D blood serum level, making sure that people don't eat vegetable oils, and making sure that people keep moving outside. But no, they don't do this, and they know what they're doing, and instead they're trying to sell vaccines that haven't been tested, or they're trying to just keep people sick so maybe Big Pharma makes more money. I don't know the money flows. I've never looked into this, but it's highly concerning.
I'm sure those producing the products marketed as vaccines would say that they were tested. I should probably just make that clear at the moment. But I have to say, Simon, it's been a real privilege to talk to you. I know it was, especially given your circumstances there, as you described them in the Brazilian rainforest. Fascinating topic that you've raised there and drawn attention to. The general efficacy of vitamin D, which the general population at large seem to be kept in the dark about for reasons that make no sense to me. Simon Godek, I'll hope to speak to you again in the future. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Jasmine, it's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, vitamin D, all our lives we've known about the presence of vitamin D, vitamin C, vitamin A, comes in pills, comes in capsules, you can buy it in the health food shop, you can buy it in the supermarket. And why won't governments promote awareness in the public at large of the unquestionable efficacy of that element?
Something so basic. Yeah, it is a weird thing. And also, of course, we get vitamin D from the sunshine, and we're constantly told, oh, sunshine's bad. You know, many would say that there are those who are trying to cut out the sunshine. They're trying to seed clouds, etc. And we're told we've got to stay indoors. Oh, sunshine, it's a terrible thing, heat. And actually, it gives us vitamin D. So, it's a crazy world we live in.
This is what I mean. It's the awareness of it. People given accurate information can make their own decisions.
Yes.
Whether or not people want to take or indeed have any faith in the supposed health benefits of vitamin D, that's neither here nor there. But the point is that the population ought at least to be made aware that there are so many good grounds for thinking that taking something cheap, readily available, readily accessible, could have a huge benefit to their health.
I suppose it's because the big pharma has such a hold on governments. They're bigger than governments. You've got the World Health Organization that is funded very largely by big pharma and, of course, the Gates Foundation. So you have policies that are really in the background pushed by big pharma. Because if we went to these cheap, readily available, effectively natural products, that would pull the rug from under their businesses. So I think we are, through the governments, through media, through celebrities, through social media, being pushed in entirely the wrong direction, purely for the profit, really.
How do we get around this? I've said it before this evening, I'll say it again. It feels as if we're under siege.
Yes.
How are ordinary people, regular people, supposed to get around this when the very agencies that exist to look after health, in inverted commas, feel as though they're working against health?
Yeah, I think, well, you said to me a while ago that you think the future is analogue, and I think you're right, that what we as individuals need to do is do, in a sense, what, not necessarily exactly, but since what Simon Godek's done, and go off-grid in whatever way we can, and to say no, to withdraw our consent. We have so much more power than we realise, and there are so many of us, and so many more than we realise, far more than those who are against us. And when we withdraw our consent, stop watching too much television, stop being on social media all the time, stop believing everything that we read, and use critical faculties and just talk to people, good people that we know, face to face in real time, then we'll start to see things a bit clearer, I think.
The amount that needs to be done to mend our relationship with health, food, and general well-being.
Yeah.
It feels like a mountain to climb. Moving on, another break, after which I'll be continuing my discussion on food and nutrition and talking to the very well-renowned nutritionist and food journalist Amanda Ursel about how ultra-processed foods may be damaging our children. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go away. Next tonight, we'll be chatting to physician, chief medical officer and co-founder of metabolic health company Levels, Casey Means, who, along with her brother Callie, wrote the book The Good Energy, in which she questions how healthcare, food and education incentives can be dangerous. Cassie joins me now. Good evening, lovely to see you.
Pleasure to be here.
When it comes to health, can I ask simply, what is wrong with us in the West, a land of wealth and technology? We don't seem to be very well.
You're exactly right. The stark economic reality is that every it's echoing, Neil. I'm so sorry. I'll just say it plainly. The stark economic reality that every patient needs to understand is that every institution that touches our health makes more money when we are sick, and it makes less money when we are healthy. There is simply a devil's bargain where there is a $6 trillion food industry and a $4 trillion healthcare industry that create a revolving door of sick and dependent patients. And this is how it works. Step one, we get people sick from cheap, addictive food. Step two, the healthcare system profits from the explosion of chronic lifestyle conditions that are created when people eat this food. I think one of the most devastating things we're seeing in the United States right now, and also in England, is the explosion of chronic illnesses in children. We're seeing 45% of children with overweight and obesity. We're seeing 30% of young adults with fatty liver disease, a metabolic disease that a pediatrician might have never seen in their lifetime 50 years ago. And what is most devastating is that there is nothing more profitable for the healthcare system than a sick child. This child is going to rack up comorbidities throughout their lifetime and be highly profitable. And unfortunately, in the current financial system, there is no financial incentive to get to the root cause. And what we know from the science is that the root cause of these issues is metabolic disease caused by toxic food and lifestyle. And instead of fixing the environment, we are medicating the population to the benefit of shareholders and not to patients.
Now, obviously, given your qualifications, you were reared and raised, so to speak, in the belly of the beast, the medical industry, alongside the pharmaceutical industry. Why and how did you waken up?
Exactly right. I did what every good medical student did. I tried to rise the ranks of the conventional system. Stanford undergrad, Stanford medical school, went on to train as a head and neck surgeon. And what I saw about 9 years into my training, I couldn't get out of my head. The more we're spending on healthcare in the United States, now $4.3 trillion, so over 20% of the GDP of the largest economy in the world, the more we spend, the sicker we are getting. So something's not working. So as a surgeon doing these dramatic interventions on patients, I had to stop and ask myself, if the more we spend, the sicker we're getting, the more we operate, the sicker we're getting, the more drugs we're prescribing, the sicker we're getting, perhaps we're focusing on the wrong problem. And this is really the core of the message of our book, Good Energy, and our mission, which is to really help reimagine a future for the healthcare system focused on the root cause that is connecting almost every leading cause of death in the United States, which is metabolic dysfunction tied to toxic food and environment. We can't operate our way out of our totally toxic food environment. And so I had to leave that field and focus on the root cause of what is making people sick. Unfortunately, the travesty is that the majority of medical leaders are standing silent in the face of these realities. Instead of doctors talking on a megaphone about how to fix our food system, how to really fix the root cause that's connecting all of these diseases, we keep them in silos. We keep the diseases, the heart disease, the cancer, the Alzheimer's, dementia, the stroke. We keep these in silos in separate specialist offices. We now have over 40 medical specialties in the United States. And as we continue to specialize, patients are getting sicker because we're not focusing on the root cause. So we've got medical leaders standing silent while we have astronomical levels of sugar in the National School Lunch Program in the United States, which serves 3 billion meals per year to students, and our absolute toxic crap. They stand silent as 10% of all federal funding for food assistance programs in the United States goes straight to soda companies. Soda is the number one line item on food assistance program. That's a direct funneling of money from the federal government to soda companies. They stand silent as medical schools don't require a single nutrition class in 4 years, despite 80% of healthcare costs going to nutrition-related diseases. So we're really seeing an epidemic of silence amongst our medical leaders and our institutions of trust on what's truly making us sick.
Casey, bear with me while I involve my studio guest, Jasmine Birtles. Jasmine, it's a terrifying litany, isn't it?
It is.
Every word that's coming out of Casey's mouth there is frightening and alarming.
It is, but frankly, it makes me think of what we've gone through in the last 4 years, and she talks about this silence at the top of the medical field, and this is what we've heard also with vaccines. I mean, I'd like to know more about childhood vaccines and what those are doing, particularly in America, where I believe every child gets around 70 vaccines before they're 17. That to me is an obscenity, and we're not hearing about the outcomes of those, as well as the nutritional problems.
Casey, everything that I read, and I read a lot around this subject. There are so many recurrent words. For example, inflammation. Inflammation seems to be, the root of all evil in many respects. And as Jasmine is pointing out, we hear again and again about autism, about ADHD and other sort of behavioural challenges that children have. All of the allergies that when I was a child at school, no one had those allergies. And now it feels as though every third child is allergic to peanuts or allergic to dairy or allergic to whatever. How can we get out of this spiral when, as you say, it's profitable for all of the key players to have fat, sick people?
You bring up such a great point, which is chronic inflammation. We hear about it all the time. Chronic inflammation, just like metabolic dysfunction, are root causes of almost every chronic disease and chronic sickness we're facing in the Western world. And you have to ask, what is chronic inflammation? It is the immune system revving up a response in response to a threat. It is our army. It is our defense. And right now, it's revved up chronically in most American patients. So this is literally biochemical fear in patients. And you have to ask, what are they afraid of? What are our cells and bodies afraid of? And the reality it is that they are afraid of the rapidly changing industrial, unnatural environment that has hit every aspect of our life and the normal culture in the Western world over the past 50 to 100 years. We've got the industrialized, nutrient-depleted, ultra-processed food system. 70% of the calories in the United States now are industrially manufactured, ultra-processed frankenfood built on industrial seed oil, sugar, and grains. That's a fear signal to the body, chronic inflammation. We're sleeping 25% less on average than 100 years ago. We've got chronic low-grade stress from these devices we're holding in our hands 24 hours a day. We have 80,000 synthetic toxins in our food, water, air, and personal care products. We're sitting 80% of the time. We're indoors 93% of the time. The world we're living in is a stark departure from what our bodies are expecting and need in terms of the signals of our environment. And the response is exactly what you speak of. It is chronic inflammation, which is a representation between the total mismatch between our environment and what our bodies need. And the result is the emergence of chronic illness.
What can we do? What can we do as individuals? What can we do to even begin to seek to regain control of our health and well-being when it would appear we're under siege from the very agencies and authorities that are supposed to be looking after us?
Number one, it's to understand the incentives and just be very dispassionate about it. Understand that every institution that touches our health benefits off of our continued illness. So be an empowered consumer. The healthcare system has produced miracles with acute issues that would immediately kill you. But when it comes to chronic conditions, this is where they have abjectly failed in preventing or reversing diseases over the past 100 years. The more we treat, the more they explode in rate. So that's step one, is just being an empowered consumer. Step two is start with food. We need to move away from ultra-processed food, which is now making up the majority of our calories, and avoid the added sugars, avoid the industrially processed oils and the ultra-refined grains. It's about moving more towards natural foods that are not covered in toxic pesticides. This is going to get us a lot of the way there. But I think there have been literally trillions of dollars of interest that have normalized a food system that is killing us and our children. And that's really step one. After that, I think it's really important to focus on, getting back to healthy behaviors with our relationship with sleep, with movement, with stress, with environmental toxin. But I would also just encourage people to take ownership over their metabolic health. So this means understanding where you stand on really key core biomarkers, things like our blood sugar levels, things like our cholesterol levels, triglycerides, HDL cholesterol. There are some very basic, cheap biomarkers that can help us know how metabolically healthy we are and how likely we are to rack up these diseases in our lifetime. So just simply understanding our glucose, our triglycerides, our HDL cholesterol, our waist circumference, and our blood pressure, those 5 biomarkers that are generally free every year on our physical, and know if we're in the optimal range, can give us a great sense of our foundational health. So really just focus on the basics, but we need to be aware of those key biomarkers for ourselves, because unfortunately, the doctor's office is not focused on a root cause lens for health. So we
Casey,
really
I'm just going to have to jump in there only because I'm running out of time. But that has felt like a tour de force from you this evening. You've so clearly and alarmingly illustrated the scale of the problem that we face. But I think also you touched on what seems to me to make sense, which is awareness and personal responsibility. Thank you so much. A conversation that we can continue another time. Thank you. Another break, after which I'll be continuing this discussion about food and nutrition and well-being, talking to the renowned nutritionist and food journalist Amanda Ursell about how ultra-processed foods that Casey mentioned there may be damaging our children. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show, where we're continuing to contemplate, Jasmine and I, with the help of guests, nutrition, health, well-being, the foods that we put into our bodies and the effect that it's having upon us. And in particular, I might add, the effect that all of this processed food is having on the health and well-being of our children. So, as I say, my next guest is nutritionist Amanda Ursell, who joins us now to consider in particular the effect of ultra-processed foods on the health and well-being of our children. Thank you so much for joining us, Amanda.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Amanda, just how bad is the situation when it comes to the food that we are feeding to the children of this country?
Well, you mentioned that word several words, ultra-processed foods. And I think this is where we have to really take a very long, hard look at ourselves as parents and as a country, as a food industry, to look at what we're doing to our children. We have a situation where most children in this country are having some kind of ultra-processed foods every day. And the problems are so kind of wide and large that it's hard to sort of like focus in on one particular problem area. So we know, for example, that food packaging may have substances in which are hormone disruptors. They may be migrating into these foods. So that's one potential problem. We know that there are additives in these foods, from flavourings to colourings to all sorts of things like humectants and goodness knows what, which are possibly okay by themselves, but when they're added together and they're eaten in this kind of cocktail over many years, we don't know what that's going to do. And if you're having those from childhood onwards, we know that there are emulsifiers in these foods which are potentially affecting the gut wall and maybe affecting diseases in the future, such as the risk of ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. I can go on. We know these foods don't need to be chewed very much because they're made to be eaten very easily. So we don't get those satiety effects that we get from when we chew foods that are in their natural state. We know that they are affecting potentially our gut health because they're lower in fibre. They're also lower in certain vitamins and minerals. And you've mentioned vitamin D on your programme. That's one of the vitamins which, when scientists scientists have looked at the composition of these foods and children eating them over time, that's one of the vitamins that they may be missing out on. And of course, then there's that whole other issue about the energy content. Because manufacturers are smart, they know how to put ingredients together to make these foods tasty. And to do that, you have to have a certain combination of fat and carbohydrates and sugars and salts that make these foods tasty, which make people want to eat more of them. And children are no different. So there's a potential that children are eating more energy than they need. And when we eat more energy, which in food we measure as calories or joules, kilojoules, then that has to go somewhere, and that goes into fat stores. And then, of course, you get the knock-on effect of what happens when children are laying down extra stores of fat. They increase their risk of high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes and all sorts of things. So, yeah, it's a problem.
Amanda, how did we get here? Here in the West, where we know so much, we've got so much information, we've got so much technology, we've done so much research into health, into nutrition. Why on earth are we at this point where we are feeding our children foods that we know are unhealthy?
Well, that's an extremely good question. So I'm very ancient. I graduated in the 1980s, and when I graduated, I think our professors could see this coming down the train track, to be honest with you. It was just at the time when TV dinners were coming out and ready meals and that sort of thing, and they were sold to us as a dream ticket, weren't they? They were going to release our time in the kitchen. They were going to be easy. They made life simpler for mums who were working, and it was sold as a bit of a dream ticket. And of course, nothing's that simple. So I think it happened relatively gradually. It happened, sort of from the 80s until the year 2000, and then they sort of became normal. They've just kind of crept into our diets, and they now are completely normal. I mean, I think people who are not eating these foods are the ones that are unusual. So, I mean, I remember making a television programme with Angela Hartnett, who's the most wonderful chef in this country, who's done lots and lots of things and written loads of books and run amazing restaurants with Gordon Ramsay. And we did a programme with some children who only really ate ready meals at home. And when they tried some of Angela's homemade versions of the foods, like spaghetti bolognese and shepherd's pie and fish pie and things like that, they didn't like them because they'd become so used to the flavours that came with the additives that were in the ultra-processed versions, that these have become normal. So how did we get there? I think...
Bear with me, Amanda. Jasmine, it seems to me to go to the heart of so much that's wrong. That we know that these ingredients and these finished products, these ultra-processed foods are negatively affecting our children's health.
Yes, absolutely.
And yet we can't get away from it.
Well, I think there are a few things that I was thinking as Ursula was talking about. I mean, one thing is when you have women going out to work so much, you do, I think, very quickly get into convenience foods. You get into what is just there, and the children will like it, and so it makes it easier. But also there's the cost. I mean, the terrible thing is that a lot of these processed foods are cheaper or seem to be cheaper than the raw stuff. So you've got convenience and cost. But having said that, I do blame parents for setting habits of eating in their children. I mean, we talked about what it was like when I was a kid, when you were a kid, when Ursula was a kid. We had much healthier food, but we did have some processed stuff as well. One thing we didn't have was crisps every day. Fizzy drinks every day. Those were for parties, and I wasn't allowed sweets, apart from at the weekends. That's what we need to do with parents.
Amanda, are there any signs of hope? There's been a lot of worrying content across a couple of hours this evening. Are there any signs for the recovery of our population?
The one thing I would say that's potentially a sign is that if you go into schools, which I do a lot, and you talk to children, they are being taught healthy eating, and we've got to jump on that as parents and try and do our very best to go on, to take them on that journey. And it is tricky doing it at home, but we've got to take control as parents. It's the most important way forward.
It surely is the most important way forward, and of course, the health and well-being of the children has to be our primary concern in health and nutrition, as in so many other matters. Amanda Ursel, thank you so much for your contribution this evening. Coming up, I'll be joined by actress turned nutritionist Davinia Taylor to talk about how she turned her own addictions into an addiction to living the healthiest life possible. Welcome back. My final guest this evening is former actress Davinia Taylor, who has turned her own self-described bad addictions into good addictions, addictions to positive things in life. Now, her former addictions were widely publicised, but in her new book, Hack Your Hormones, she talks about how she will always be addicted to something, but that now it's healthy living. Davinia joins me now. Lovely to see you.
Hello, Nat, thank you for having me again.
You and I have spoken before on GB News about Matters Health.
Yeah.
I would put this to you. It seems like a paradox to me that we here in the West, with so much at our disposal in terms of understanding, education, wealth and technology, that so many people are visibly sicker and unhappier than they used to be. What's the way out?
It is. Yeah, it's very strange. I mean, for me, I had an addiction to alcohol, and it was something, I mean, I've been sober 15 years, so let's put it into context. I mean, I think I drank for 5 years, but I've been sober 15 years. But that addictive mechanism in me is always seeking a hormone called dopamine, because I'm naturally low on it, so I seek it. White wine used to give me dopamine. It used to wake me up. It didn't relax me, it woke me up. Gave me a bit of confidence, energy, and helped me do things that I would I'd find things boring. So paying the bills, I'd have to have a glass of wine first, you know? And as soon as I put the alcohol down, something else crept in. And that was carbohydrates. Now they're sneaky. So carbohydrates are things like grains, whole grains, pasta, pizza, and of course our old nemesis, sugar. And because that's such a subtle foe, you obviously don't get drunk. You just get overweight as you're trying to chase this dopamine hormone, this elevated mood. And that's what crept up on me over the 5 years that I gave up alcohol. I put the booze down. 5 years later, I found myself very overweight, very underwhelmed, a completely flatline, because of course I wasn't getting the same energy that I was. I've become tolerant to these addictive foods. And I think what I'm looking at as a population is mass addiction, but because it's now accepted to be a larger size. So I'm a size 10 to 12, but when I was like a 16, I was considered normal, very, very normal, curvy almost. It was like, oh, you're a real woman. But I was so inflamed, I couldn't get my engagement rings on, my knees were swollen, my feet were swollen, but it was considered normal. And I think we've normalized an addiction to carbohydrates and sugars, an addiction to vegetable oil, which we'll go into. And all of a sudden, nobody seemed to have noticed that we are dealing with a massive hangover. Nobody has any energy to do any exercise, to go outside, to get excited. And I think that's the problem. It's actually happening younger and younger, because you put the alcohol away, but people are still getting non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Even children as young as 11 and even younger are getting this because of the obsession with carbohydrates. And I know I'm going on here, but one of your previous guests said that we're talking about healthy eating education in the food system, in the school system. Now, once again, they're going to be pushing more fruit, more whole grains, more pasta. This is just more sugar. And when you get these sort of innocent smoothies, again, it's just ramping up dopamine in the child's system that converts to sugar that sits in their liver under the guise of healthy foods. We need to get back to meat. Meat and 2 veg, saturated fat. Polyunsaturated fat is great in tiny amounts, but the whole rhetoric around these veg oils being heart healthy has systematically ruined our health. We have changed our body fat composition from a saturated fat, which is like a firm body fat, into this weird jelly-like polyunsaturated fat, which is really, really unstable and gets inflamed. Because it's unsaturated, it is unstable. And this is what we've done to ourselves since the 60s. I mean, you just look at the difference in the bodies between the 60s and now, and we are a different beast altogether.
Bear with me, Davinia. Jasmine, that is absolutely something that I've recognised. We have changed the species.
Yes, we have.
In my lifetime.
Yeah, and yes, exactly. And it's exactly right. You see the pictures of people in the 60s, 70s, even just about 80s. I think that's when the fats really started. And it's a whole different thing. But one thing that listening again to Davinia and others, what I keep finding with food, when we talk about food, everybody has a different view and things keep changing. Now, I remember, probably like you, when meat and 2 veg was demonised, and we were all told we should have a Mediterranean diet. Nobody talks about a Mediterranean diet. In fact, I mean, that involves olive oil, which I guess is a vegetable oil, which is suddenly not good for you. I mean,
cold-pressed olive oil. I have to correct you there.
Is that all right?
Is the good stuff.
Oh, all right, good. Phew, that's a relief. I've got that at home.
Davinia, are there signs of hope? I've been looking for signs of hope this evening. You know, there are so many ideas out there. There are so many diets. There are so many therapies.
Yeah.
Can you short-circuit it for people and show an easy roadmap to something better?
Absolutely. If your great-grandmother, no matter where she lived on the planet, if she didn't recognise it as food, put it back. And that includes rapeseed oil and sunflower oil, which is actually manufactured using something called hexane, and it's bleached and it's deodorized. This stuff is actually a soap. It's a detergent. It shouldn't be in our food chain. So if you see that on a packet, put it back. You're going to be able to get off rapeseed and sunflower oil far easier than you are sugar. But remember, if your great-grandmother wouldn't recognise it as food, don't have it. It's not food. It is just a Bliss Point product.
I need to talk to you for much longer than I have time available. But you are full of the good stuff when it comes to talking about food. So thank you so much, Davinia Taylor. Have to let Davinia go there, only because time is against me all the time. You've been watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Thanks very much for joining me, and I will see you all next week.